Welcome in to another new podcast from the Association for Materials Protection and Performance. Of course, we're best known by the shorthand acronym of AMP. As always, I'm your host, Ben Dubose, and I'm the news editor with the AMP publications team. For today's show, I'm joined by Kern Williams, Government Affairs Manager at AMP, and we're going to be discussing some breaking news regarding the replacement of lead pipes here in the United States. If you have not heard, earlier this month, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, of course that's also known as the EPA, they issued a final rule that requires drinking water systems across the country to identify and replace lead pipes within 10 years. Known as the Lead and Copper Rule Improvements, or LCRI, the rule also requires for more rigorous testing of drinking water, and it mandates a lower threshold for communities to take action to potentially protect people from lead exposure in the water. There are definitely quite a few links to corrosion and materials protection throughout that process, and thus there's clearly some implications and also opportunities for many of our AMP members to get involved. So that's what we're going to have Kern breaking down today. Kern, why don't you start by introducing yourself to our audience and tell us a bit about yourself, both in terms of your role within AMP and government affairs, as well as the overall mission of government affairs and what it seeks to do within AMP.
Sure. First off, thank you for having me, Ben. I'm Kern Williams, Manager at Government Affairs for AMP. Just got started in August, so for the last 2 months, it's a somewhat quiet time around DC as we look forward to the election. I've just been getting to, know AMP. I took a CIP1 course last week to get some more technical background, and otherwise I've been meeting with kind of associations and congressional offices who may be interested in our space, introducing ourselves and promoting the AMP brand. A little bit about myself. I moved to DC in 2018 to work for Senator Doug Jones from Alabama. I'm from Alabama. Started out as his driver, worked my way up the office, ended up doing his policy portfolio on national security. He was on this Armed Services Committee, so was a natural fit. Following the 2020 election, I spent a couple of years at a Virginia-based law firm. I then spent a couple more years at a DC-based multi-client lobbying firm. From there, I made the jump over to AMP in August.
And then government affairs within AMP, that's basically the liaison, the link between AMP and these offices on Capitol Hill, right?
Yeah, not just on Capitol Hill. Throughout the administration, for example, we had a market leader in town in DC the last couple of days, meeting with regulatory agencies. This is a quiet time for Congress as they're all campaigning, so it's a great opportunity to get in with some kind of non-politicals who are going to be here next Congress, no matter who wins. So meeting with a couple different regulators in the pipeline space. It's a great example of kind of what we do on any given week.
All right, so let's talk about this lead pipes thing specifically, because it was announced earlier this month, and really this has been an ongoing storyline for 10 plus years, dating back to the disaster in Flint, which was, 2014, I think? When was the Flint disaster?
Yeah, so it kind of depends how you date it. You're right to say that it goes back more than 10 years, kind of depending on what narrative you're following. I think you could trace it all the way back to 1991. The first kind of legislation that established a regime for thinking about and approaching lead and copper in America was passed, known as the Lead and Copper Rule, LCR.
Okay.
That was kind of the first authority, Congress's first stab at regulating lead and copper in public drinking water systems. Of course, yes, you're right about the 2014 Flint crisis, I think, accelerating and kind of drawing public attention. There was various efforts to, varying degrees of success for the following 6-7 years. The next kind of big action in my book would be in 2021. The Biden administration announced a specific lead pipe and paint action plan, which is what led to ultimately the ruling on the LCRI. So 2021 lead pipe and paint action plan, folks, and I'm sure many may know, that's around the same time 2 big congressional funding bills were passed. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Basically, those 2 bills put in billions of dollars to the EPA and other administrative agencies towards this whole of government lead pipe and paint action plan. The next step was for EPA to issue a ruling and seek comment, which it did in 2023. And so, as you alluded to earlier this month, on October 8th, kind of the final step in that rulemaking process was taken by the EPA, and that is what is known as the LCRI.
And what's, at a high level, the general link to corrosion control and materials protection? What's the link between these overall initiatives, what the government is trying to do, and the opportunities for our members to get involved and be a part of that process?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of opportunities. I think it kind of depends on the exact market and kind of situation of the member itself, of course.
Sure.
But generally, what this rule does is lowers the lead action level, which ultimately means more water systems across the country are going to be required to take action to replace, repair lead pipes and paints in water systems over the next 10 years, basically accelerating the demand for some of the services that many of our members provide. Water systems will need to be complying with provisions within 3 years following publication of the final rule, which is expected to be late 2027. So this is not the funding. Let me back up. The funding is for, communities and municipal water systems to apply. There has been a real need and urgency for that in hundreds of communities, unfortunately, across the country. Some big cities, and especially after Flint, took action. The idea here is to kind of spur more action at the local municipal level. I think that for members, there's a couple things to be looking at. A, you want to, be monitoring this funding opportunity as it comes. Now that this final rule has been established, in Q1, Q2 of 2025, I think we should see a lot of money flowing out. There has been a bit of a bottleneck on that funding from the laws passed 3 years ago as this final rule is promulgated. Now that we're at this point, I think that we can probably expect to see significant funding coming out from the EPA and similar agencies. And there's all kinds of information. As an aside, there's all kinds of information on the EPA website. I would point kind of all members there. There's a lot of kind of follow-up actions that they recommend depending on who you are. And we can touch on that more later, I guess.
Yeah. And just at a technical level, we're talking about technologies to prevent lead from leaching into the water. That's the thing, right?
Exactly.
Okay. I know we can't get too specific because all of this, other than the 10-year timeline, is subject to change a little bit. But broadly speaking, what does the timeline look like moving forward in terms of, what's going to happen the next couple of years, the couple of years after that? If you're sort of mapping out what the next 10 years are going to look like, what are the general themes there?
Yeah. Well, of course, there's this election 2 weeks from yesterday. Something that members should know is that kind of regardless of the outcome of this election, this was a final ruling by EPA.
Okay.
It's not something that the administration could just kind of unilaterally turn over if they wanted to. Either way, this is kind of baked in at this point. So with that said, regardless of who wins, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, I think we should expect to see significant funding flowing to municipalities early next year and really over the next 2 to 3 years. And that funding will serve a variety of purposes, both kind of creating the action plans to address corrosion and lead leaching into water supplies, and then, actually paying for the services and the work to be done on a case-by-case basis. In terms of exactly, the pace of that funding flowing out, it's very difficult to say at this point. When we back up, the funding passed 3 or 4 years ago was a historical level of funding, and there's kind of no good comparison from previous kind of actions like this. So I think everyone's in a bit of a wait and see mode in terms of pacing. With that said, over the next 2 to 3 years, as communities grapple with next steps, I think that increases market opportunities for members ultimately.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about it, so this stems obviously at the federal level, but you're saying that a lot of these opportunities are going to be delegated locally, right? So if a member or a member company wants to, potentially take advantage of the grant funding, even though it might sound counterintuitive, given that this is a rule, recently passed by the Biden-Harris administration's EPA, it sounds like what you're saying is that they should be more focused on positioning themselves in local markets, right?
Yep. That's who's going to be making, ultimately the vendor decisions and contract decisions. There are half dozen different funding vehicles for municipalities and states to get funding. There are a few different what's called revolving funds with state and local drinking water revolving funds. That's basically money that comes in lump from a federal source to municipalities and states to access, and then is kind of replenished as those municipalities draw on that pot of funding.
Okay.
So all to say, yes, I think that almost certainly the best move for members right now is to be in close communication as close as possible with their kind of municipalities in their market area or around them, near them, those they're familiar with, to be trying to get onto this action as soon as possible. There's going to be a real urgency at the beginning of the year to move on this funding, regardless of who wins. So, I think that there are a few upcoming EPA opportunities like webinars and similar kind of instructions that both water systems and AMP members should be paying attention to, and happy to provide more information on that.
Yeah. And just talking more specifically, when you say local municipalities, what are the actual branches or examples of, the actual group that a member might want to reach out to?
It's just going to be different depending on where you are.
Okay.
It's whoever is in charge of the water system for
Okay.
the municipality or the county or the city or, kind of whatever the area is that's in question.
So you mentioned the upcoming U.S. election and that not changing a lot because this is pretty much set in stone regardless of anything that changes or doesn't change with the administration, correct?
There is one caveat there it's not particularly relevant, but it's just, kind of the way this place works. There is something called the Congressional Review Act. If one party were to win the administration, House, and Senate, they could do something called Congressional Review Act, CRA, which is the only way to overturn this final ruling. Mm-hmm. That is extremely unlikely to the point of not really being a possibility, but I just want to caveat saying that is, I'm sure, people could float out there and, potentially as a scare tactic one way or another.
Right. But that's more of a theoretical exercise because what I was going to say is that this is one of the few issues on Capitol Hill these days that's not particularly partisan, right? I mean, this is the type of thing that has support on both sides of the aisle. So this is something that, if anything, maybe there's more opportunities in the future, regardless of the administration. This isn't something that either party has a political advantage to try and push back on, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Unfortunately, I think people of all stripes across the country are affected by lead in drinking water. And it's something that is a great opportunity for AMP and our advocacy because it is such a bipartisan issue. And yeah, as you said, kind of regardless of who wins, I think that we'll continue to have opportunities here.
Right, because at the end of the day, if a politician can say that they've helped reduce or eliminate lead in drinking water in their community, that's something that, regardless of if they're a Democrat or Republican, that's an accomplishment for them, right?
Exactly.
So this is something that, people should not sweat regardless of the upcoming election result being pushed away. That's more of a theoretical exercise than a practical one, it sounds like. You mentioned the webinars. I'm curious, where people can go to sign up for those, as well as any other educational resources that are out there, because I'm sure, you've talked about reaching out to municipalities, but it varies so much from one location to the next. There's so many potential options here. Is there a one-stop shop or a two-stop shop to where someone could go to and, start the process of learning how to get involved?
Yeah, I think that the first place everyone should go is the EPA's website on lead and copper rule improvements. And I think that's pretty easily found through a quick Google search or kind of similar function. But on that website, and I'm looking at it now, there's just so much information. It's hard to get into in a short amount of time. There are technical fact sheets for water system professionals of all stripes. There's actually, I'm looking at three to four different fact sheets. There's also, as I kind of alluded to earlier, 2 upcoming webinars that folks want to be aware of. And I will also add that all materials from those webinars will be made available to the public afterwards. So there's no real urgency to be on it, just something to be aware of as a future resource. Those webinars, there's one advertised to the general public happening on October 24th, and a webinar for drinking water utilities and professionals on November 14th. I think that 14th one may be a bit more applicable for our members, but again, those are going to be made public.
Yeah. And I'm assuming these will have info as far as, you mentioned that a lot of the technologies may vary from one market to the next, depending on what a certain municipality wants to do. But the bottom line is they'll give you sort of an overview of, what the technologies are, and thus, you see what's in your wheelhouse and what's not, right?
Exactly. As I said, there are a few different fact sheets that I would direct everyone to go look at. There's quite a bit of information there. There is also a link back to a Biden-Harris administration fact sheet that kind of adds some context in terms of what a larger overall effort is here. I would also point folks to the AMP advocacy website. We've got a one-pager that I think has some helpful links on it, including a link to that EPA press release and the LCRI rule text itself for those who are interested in kind of really delving in and seeing what the rules actually say.
Okay, I know this is not the only thing going on for you all in government affairs, but it might be the only thing that's not subject to the election. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, sort of. I think that you hit on a great point earlier, not just with the lead and copper rule. Generally, corrosion is a very bipartisan issue. It affects everyone pretty equally and substantially. So, regardless of who wins, we have a pretty good sense of what our agenda is going to be. We just kind of wait to finalize that.
Right, that's what I mean. You have a good idea of what the agenda is going to be, and it should be, something that regardless of the result is doable in large part, right?
Yeah, totally. It's a huge opportunity. It's a big part of why I wanted to come join, work for AMP, and advocate on behalf of professionals in this industry. There's a lot of work to be done.
What does early 2025 look like once you've got, the election's going to be in the book within the next few weeks, hopefully, certainly by January 20th, you'll have the next administration inaugurated, you'll have the new class of Congress. And so once you get past that January 20th date and all the uncertainty is in the rearview mirror, what does early 2025 look like when it comes to, actually, implementing some of this agenda at AMP and the opportunities for members to potentially, get involved in that process?
Well, first off, I would back up and say that as we enter the new year, we'll be definitely communicating to members, pushing out a ton of information about advocacy opportunities throughout the year.
Okay.
In the past, AMP has kind of had one general advocacy day per year. We're trying to increase the number of those and kind of issues across multiple different kind of policy verticals. So that said, in early 2025, I think folks should be looking for communication from the AMP advocacy team, from myself and any others kind of working with me. The budget process starts pretty much as soon as the new Congress begins in January, probably even before that inauguration date. And that budget process is, at this point, in terms of the U.S. Congress, our policy is largely dictated through the budget because that's what passes every year. So, that's our opportunity to be engaged, advocate for our priorities, kind of depending on what's in play, and work with our congressional champions to promote the industry.
Sounds good. All right. So if a member or member company listening that, develops corrosion inhibitors, corrosion-based treatment, wants to, get involved in this process, you mentioned potentially reaching out to local municipalities. You mentioned the resources at the EPA website. But if they want to get in touch with you or AMP specifically, what's the best way that they can do that if they want to get the ball rolling on this?
Best place to get in touch with me is my email, which is kern.williams, that's KERN.Williams @amp.org. I am happy to communicate directly with members and point folks in the right direction as best I can. Part of what I'm doing already is meeting with member companies and kind of complementary associations in our industry space. Here in DC, I'm always happy to meet with more members.
And then the website is amp.org/about/government affairs, or just go to the government affairs tab on amp.org, the homepage. And then the two main initiatives beyond what we've been discussing today, it's the Bridge Corrosion Prevention and Repair Act and the Freedom to Invest in Tomorrow's Workforce Act, which has workforce development implications, correct?
Yeah, and I would just highlight that as this Congress is ending, both those laws sunset, or both those potential bills sunset. So in the new Congress, we'll have a completely new agenda there.
Sure, but that just reflects the types of initiatives that you're looking at. Yeah, and so I know some of those things have sort of been pushed to the back burner given the election uncertainty, but I think the links on the government affairs page and, you've got a handy sort of sidebar, stay informed with the timeline of recent announcements, that does sort of give a good idea of what we're working on as far as the AMP agenda and what's likely to come in some fashion in 2025, correct?
Yep. I think where you just listed also has the link to the one-pager on the LCRI, which itself has the link to the EPA website. So if folks are having any difficulty finding, that's one access point.
Perfect. All right. Excellent insight there from Kern Williams, Government Affairs Manager at AMP. And with that, we'll bring this episode to a close. For Kern and the Government Affairs team, I'm Ben Dubose with AMP Publications. And if you want more resources from AMP or our publications within the association, just visit the aforementioned amp.org, as well as our publication websites such as materialsperformance.com and coatingspromag.com. And while there, if you search for lead pipes, you can definitely find a ton of background information, case studies, that kind of stuff related to the types of projects that we've been discussing today. Anyway, that will do it for this episode. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.